down the line, and I want to set the stage and ask each of you to define criminal justice reform from your position in the criminal justice system, if you would. What does it mean to you, so that we're starting with the definition of terms. We'll start with 2 minutes on that.
On this end of the line or that end of the line? All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. We're the first responders. We're individuals' initial encounter with the criminal justice system. So we have to be, and we are, the leaders in criminal justice reform. I am so fortunate and so grateful that I have two wonderful criminal justice partners, State Attorney Warren, Madam Public Defender Holt, and I think that not only we've have done a phenomenal job of accomplishing diversion programs, the diversion programs have been those that are probably the top-notch quality that I see looking at the other counties who participate in that. We have to keep our young people out of the criminal justice system. And we've done a phenomenal job at that and tweaked it. So all non-violent offenders now, we're down to 4 offenses that aren't eligible for the diversion program. Along the same lines as why not do it for adults? We've created an adult diversion program. Again, it's worked out phenomenally well. Along the same lines is when you talk about the mental health crisis. You talk about the opioid epidemic and drug addiction. Those individuals need treatment. They don't need incarceration. So do we want to be tough on crime? Yes. And these diversion programs, these quality treatment programs, allow your sheriff's office to focus on those violent offenders that want to victimize our community. That's smart use of resources, what that is. We don't want to be dedicating time to individuals who need to be diverted. So heavily focused on that. Madam Public Defender?
Well, for me, criminal justice reform means that we're going to have to make some significant policy changes, and that's going to start in my world. It starts in Tallahassee, where the laws are made and where policies are set. So for me, I would like to see a significant policy change coming out of Tallahassee, where they realize that we need a public health type of approach and model for this state. We need to look at these not in the criminal justice system eyes, but through the eyes of how to improve our communities, how to bring infrastructure to our communities that addresses the true inequities that exist within our community, to address mental health issues, addiction issues, socioeconomic issues, again from a public health model and from strengthening our communities and strengthening those individuals that can lead us into a better and a more prosperous type of life. Criminal justice reform to me means accepting discretion and not mandatory decisions. For instance, this year, finally, after so many years of saying minimum mandatories are a problem, we had some shifting. Mandatory juvenile direct files had a significant impact here in this community. Finally, this year, the legislature withdrew the mandatory requirement that our state attorney must file certain juvenile offenses into the system. That will make a significant difference in building this community in a better way. So for me, criminal justice reform means that we will look at our community in a holistic manner, look at what our community really needs, and if we can't accomplish that through Tallahassee, everything that the sheriff has said are things that we have put in place here in our community in spite of prohibitions that existed, that didn't allow us to do these things, but we did it because we knew it was a better way for our community to move forward and for our children to move forward. So I'm looking forward to a good, prosperous discussion. The other theme was our state attorney has done a wonderful job in acknowledging the inequities of the criminal justice system and has helped us to fix those. And so I want to thank him publicly. Thank
you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I ran for state attorney on a bold platform of criminal justice reform. And reform to me is about an idea. It's about the idea that we have to focus on the long-term impact of what we do every day in the system. How do we build a safer community in the long run? How do we reduce crime in the long run? What's the long-term impact of prosecution on a person, on a person's family, on the community? Reform is about making sure that we're not only focused on one goal, punishing offenders, but rather we're focused on all the goals of the system. Accountability, reducing recidivism, rehabilitating offenders, and standing up for victims. For far too long, we have looked at criminal justice through this narrow prism of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, rather than thinking more broadly and strategically about how we advance the mission of criminal justice, making our communities safer and stronger and healthier while promoting justice and fairness in the system. So in practice, reform is about prioritizing the types of crime that pose the greatest threats to our community. Reform is about steering kids away from the system rather than trapping them in it. Reform is about second chances for first-time offenders. Reform is about thinking differently about how we support our neighbors and loved ones who suffer from mental illness and substance abuse through treatment rather than through arrest and incarceration. Reform is about addressing racial disparities in the system. Reform is about minimizing poverty traps. Reform is about proactive engagement with the community to build transparency and trust. It's about conviction and integrity. It's about minimizing poverty traps. It's about making sure we're using data-driven solutions to make sure we're checking on what works rather than just assuming we know what works. And above all, reform is about making sure that prosecutors understand their job is not about seeking convictions, but about seeking justice.
I feel like you should just say amen and sit down. No, it's really an honor to be with you today. For me, it's really looking at having this conversation about what smart justice is. How do we set up a process in place in Tallahassee at the local level where people are willing to have a conversation about what criminal justice really should look like, what they want their justice system to look like. We always start with this kind of question is, they say, well, we're going to talk about criminal justice reform, we're going to talk about your prisons. Let's start with a conversation about who we want in prison. How do we separate the people that we're scared of from the people that we're mad at? That is the first portion of the discussion that needs to be happening. And then, how do we set up a process that consistently lets us look at the data, that consistently lets us look at the research, where we're able to have this conversation in the community and at the state level about what our criminal justice system should look like and what are the best practices that we've gleaned from across the country at dealing with this. The simple truth is, it's true. It's a lot about addiction. A lot of addiction is driving this conversation. It's also a lot about mental health. But at the fundamental level, it's also about broken families. I always tell people, they ask me this conversation, they say, well, if you could just fix one thing in Florida to make the state better, what would it be? How do I keep families together? That, if we could figure that out, it would solve so many of these other challenges that we're dealing with. So that's fundamentally, it's about how do we set up a process that's constantly reviewing, constantly refreshing, thinking about best practices, focusing on what is smart justice, what is smart judicial reforms, and how do we be smart on crime, just as much as we're talking about being strong on crime. Thank you.
Thank you. So I do have one more question before we go to the audience, and I'd hope that you could do this as a simple phrase or a simple sentence. What is the one change that still needs to happen?
I'll start on this side, if you don't mind. Well, I think you need consistent leadership at the state level focused on this conversation and a willingness to have a conversation about it. It has been 2 decades since we've reviewed the criminal punishment code in the state of Florida on an in-depth basis. We have had seven different Department of Corrections heads since I was elected in 2010. There has been no consistent leadership. When there's no consistent leadership, everybody understands we'll just wait out the next guy and we'll move on. And that is pervasive in the criminal justice system. And we need governors and legislatures that are willing to step up and lead on this topic, as much as we need the community to rise up and demand local elected officials think about this process differently.
There is no silver bullet. There's no one solution. I mean, I'm really proud of what we've accomplished with regard to civil citations for juveniles and adults in Hillsborough County to give first-time offenders a second chance, working with our local stakeholders. I'm proud of things we've done in our office to address the criminalization of poverty, especially with regard to driving license suspensions when they're economic based on an ability to pay. But since reform is really about problem-solving thinking, problem-solving approaches, I think two important areas going forward where we're thinking outside the box. One is what we're doing to disarm domestic abusers, to aggressively and consistently enforce the law to take guns out of the hands, and I thank the Sheriff Chronister and the Sheriff's Office for their participation in that. And I think another creative solution we have is with regard to fulfilling the promise of Amendment 4, the rocket docket that we're talking about implementing here, working with the public defender and other local stakeholders. Those are two good examples of how we're thinking outside the box to solve problems in our local system.
Thank you. We need to work hard to not criminalize mental health illness. We need to work hard to not criminalize addiction. And we need to work hard to not use the criminal justice system to solve society's problems, which is what we do right now. And we need to ensure that we don't have law enforcement running the largest mental health institution in the state of Florida. Those changes really need to be made.
Senator Brandes alluded to it, the biggest room that I believe for development and improvement when it comes to criminal justice reform is in the detention side of the house. Making sure that we're not just warehousing prisoners. Making sure they're being equipped with the educational programs that they have. We've expanded those. Vocational training. We feed 4,000 prisoners 3 times a day. Why not bring instructors in and allow them when they leave, they have a piece of paper. Under development programs building for an electrical contractor, year program now 3 months. When they walk out, they have a piece of paper. Getting them the treatment programs that they need. Madam Public Defender alluded to it. We have more people in our detention facility under psychotropic meds and under treatment than any of the 3 state mental health facilities. So now we work with the county commissioners like Sandy Merman, who work. We used to give them 3 days medication when they left. Now they get 30 days medication. We're teamed up with an outside provider to get them the help that they need to help them continue and prosper. And I just signed the contract this week with an employment agency. When they get out, they work with our caseworkers. Not only do they leave with a gainful employment as they leave.
Thanks you all. Let's start with our first question from a new member today.
Good afternoon. This question is addressed. This is Christina Palin. This question is addressed to Ms. Holt. And Ms. Holt, as a result of growing number of complaints from the Black and Hispanic community regarding prosecutors withholding evidence that is favorable to the accused, we have formed a civilian oversight committee talking about addressing Senator Brandes' committee, local citizens rising up. And we're here today, I'm the chair of that committee, is a civilian oversight committee for prosecutorial misconduct. Mr. Doss is with me. My question is, what is your office doing in response to implementing procedures that actually combat this problem of prosecutors withholding favorable evidence to the accused?
So one of the things, and I'll just go ahead and say to Mr. Warren today, as a normal process of our discovery process, we filed demands for discovery immediately upon being appointed. Beginning on probably the 1st of August, and I'll just say this publicly today, we're going to actually file a demand for Brady and Giglio information together with the demand for discovery, so that's going to go out from the very front end. On the other hand, the other thing that I do is internally in my office, we train tremendously in this area, that you have to read police reports very carefully, that you have to talk to the officers that are involved in the arrest, you have to talk to the detectives, you have to talk to victims, you have to talk to your client, and your client will tell you a lot about what went on out there. And then you have to pursue those things. So for me, what I'm doing is internally training. We're now going to file demands for Brady and Giglio in every single case, whether it's a felony, a homicide, a misdemeanor, a traffic case. And so from the upfront, that'll be something that we do. We also meet regularly with the heads of all of Mr. Warren's departments in order to discuss how can we better improve the process, because it starts, frankly, with law enforcement, because as the sheriff said, they're the front responders. So we need to know, Mr. Warren needs to know, I need to know everything they know and everything that they have in their possession. Those are all things and improvements that need to be made. I'm very fortunate that the sheriff is willing to meet with us and discuss with that with us, and is also willing to give us broad access to a lot of the information that he has. And so I'll thank him publicly for the improvements that he's doing in the system.
Lynn Gray, school board member, and I'm going to put my education hat on. I want to also thank Andrew Warren and Julian Holt and Chad. I don't know the other person as well, but you've been working extensively with the positive behavior intervention system, which really gives our children another way of staying out of the jail, but rather being taken care of before they get to that stage. And I don't know whether people in here know that, but you all work with our Hillsborough County Public Schools. So the question is, what more can we do, you do, to keep our children out of incarceration? Is there anything also that, as a school board member, I can do?
I'll touch on it so much. It's the mental health counseling that the kids are getting. You know, let's Baker Act them, let's lock them up. And I think the school and the school board and school administration's done a wonderful job. It's just getting the counselors that each school needs to make sure that they can properly identify a child that's in need and divert them before law enforcement's called to try to, hey, there's a last resort, let's Baker Act this child. So try to identify it early on and get them the treatment that they need early before, so it can be more preventative.
And to follow up on the sheriff's point, just to throw out a couple numbers for you. From the end of 2016 to the end of 2018, a 2-year span, the number of kids being arrested in Hillsborough County, youths under the age of 21, was reduced 19%. During that same period, 2 years, number of kids under the age of 18, so 17 and under, a 58% reduction. 58%. That is huge. And that's not from one program. It's from the civil citation program. It's from the sheriff's efforts to work with us to break the school to prison pipeline. It's from all different diversion programs that we have. PBIS has a role in that. There's so many different things that have contributed to that tremendous reduction in putting kids into the system. What do we need to keep doing? We need to keep building on the programs we have. And to the senator's point, we need to strengthen our families. There is no secret to the people that we see coming through the system. There's ties between the criminal justice system and obviously economics and education, socioeconomic factors, and family factors. And by addressing those other avenues, strengthening our economy, improving our schools, strengthening our families, that's how we're going to keep more kids out of the system.
Let me offer you 2 suggestions. We know that there's a spike in juvenile crime during the summer. What are we doing? What is the school board doing to partner with the sheriff's office and the state's attorneys and public defenders to have programming in communities during the summers so that kids are engaged? Number 2, what is the school board doing to engage kids in the Department of Juvenile Justice that are in this 7 or 8 day window before they're transitioned back out? Because what happens today, what I've seen as I travel around the state is, you go into the Department of Juvenile Justice, everybody says, oh, you're in the system. Well, no, what happens is these kids get released back to their foster home. They leave their foster home, they're back on the streets. They're back in the system. If you go talk to any Department of Juvenile Justice, they'll say, we see the same kids over and over and over sometimes. What are we doing to engage them, to make sure that they're in school, that they're showing up in school, that they're, that the truancy is not the issue? So those are the things I think that are 2 solid recommendations.
And Lynn, I know you already know this. Obviously, the Public Defender's Office entered into an agreement with the school board, and we're going to have a guardian advocate program that we're going to kick off this year for the school system. And why we wanted to do that is because a lot of times, not only do the teachers not understand what they're about to do when they call law enforcement in to intervene into situations, but a lot of times children don't know what their rights are going forward. And so we want them to make intelligent decisions at the front end when they're first talking to law enforcement. We're not there to impede the investigation. What we're there to do is advise the kids and tell them, hey, here's all the options that may be available to you rather than to be arrested, put in the detention center, and then charged with a criminal offense. And a lot of times the parents can't be contacted. So when you have an opportunity for a child to have someone to advocate for them, the school's not advocating for them at that point, because obviously they found themselves in a kind of criminal justice type of situation.